Hi, everybody. Welcome to Virtual 18. I'm honored to be able to talk to you today about something that I'm passionate about, which is the education of English learners. In coming up with a title or a topic for this presentation, I decided to draw on my own experience. In the past 6 months in my work, I've been observing in over 100 classrooms that have English learner students in them. So it's given me a broad perspective of what some of the issues are in teaching English learners. And the title is, How Should We Push English Learners? And I think that that's apropos because teachers sometimes are unsure about how much they should encourage or push their students, challenge them versus frustrating them and possibly discouraging them. So we want to make sure that students are adequately challenged, but then striking that appropriate balance. Before we address this question explicitly, what I'd like to do is lay some groundwork on some other issues that have emerged with this, through this process of observing so many classrooms. One of the issues is the use of instructional time. Now, our English learners are students who can least afford wasted instructional time. They're learning English, the language of English, and they're learning content through English. And so we need to make sure that every minute of class time is used to engage students in activities around reading, writing, speaking, and listening in English. Many classrooms are very productive classrooms where there's a lot of interaction. As a result of well-planned lessons and well-paced instruction, students are highly engaged. And that is one of the reasons they are engaged, is because teachers have planned well and keep the instruction moving. Another aspect of a good use of instructional time is classrooms where students are given specific tasks, where the students understand what the expectation is. So in the class that you're looking at, let's say, for example, the teacher, after reading a bit, she pauses and says, okay, Aziz doesn't want to go to a new school. Talk with your group about why that might be. You've got 30 seconds. The teacher times the 30 seconds. At the end, she gives a signal, and the students come back together, report out, maybe write down what some of their predictions were. As they read more in the text, when they come across those predictions, they can either verify them or dispute them. So there's a lot that can happen with that, but it's a very specific task that's given. And there was appropriate timing. She didn't give them 5 minutes to talk about this. It doesn't take 5 minutes. It takes about 30 seconds to turn to, as you see, some partners and talk a little bit about what they might see or why he might want to not want to be going to another school. So it's appropriate timing. I have seen many, many instances where students are given inordinate amounts of time to talk about very simple turn and talk subjects. And so that leads, unfortunately, to disengagement. And there are many classes where students look more like this. And I'll go through some of the reasons that I have seen. One being that our English learners are left to do independent reading, and I put it in quotes because I don't see actually a lot of productive reading going on. It's more students looking like these two students, or just being off task, maybe thumbing through the pages but not engaged in reading. And that makes sense because English learners are still in the process of learning the language. They may not have the language to be able to sustain reading with comprehension for 20, 30, 40 minutes, which is not uncommon practice. So If we want students to enjoy reading, if we want them to be strong readers and develop that reading stamina that's going to assist them as they move up the grade levels, we need to teach them to read well. Students aren't going to learn how to read by selecting a book that they like and sitting down reading independently for very long periods of time, especially our English learners. For somebody who speaks English and can comprehend, that's a whole different story. But for our English learners, they really need to be provided with challenging text that has appropriate scaffolds so that they understand the text and are learning the academic language represented in the book. So we need to be cautious of giving students too much independent time. Another area is that I see in an effort for teachers to want to provide oral language opportunities for students, they give them trivial topics to talk about, which leads to disengagement. So, for example, in a class I saw, the teacher asked the students to talk to their partner about what they did over the weekend. And these students had about 2 to 3 minutes to talk. Now, first of all, there's essentially no academic benefit to talking about what you did over the weekend. There's no or virtually no academic language being used. It's not tied to any text or story that they've read. They're not going to write about it. There's no literacy involved whatsoever and no real academic language. So it's really a poor use of instructional time. We want to give them something much more interesting to talk about. So for example, with the previous slide, maybe ask the students, how would you feel if you were going to change schools? What would you be thinking about if you were told that you had to change schools? Again, give a specific amount of time, what the teacher deems appropriate, and then talk about it, come back, and then you have something to check within the text to see if that is what happened to the character. So it's tied to something more academic. In a related area, there's a bit of oversharing that happens. And this is partially due to, as I mentioned, too much time being given to talk about topics, even if they're engaging, but to say, how would you feel if you were Aziz and had to change schools? That still only needs about 45 seconds, 60 seconds to talk about giving each student an opportunity to share their perspective, then come back together, share out, and move on with the lesson. Giving 3 to 5 minutes is a very poor use of instructional time. The other aspect of this oversharing is that teachers are relinquishing a lot of their teaching time to students. And our English learners, in many cases, are really struggle with being partnered with someone and are expected to come up on their own, well, together, with significant details about some kind of reading, when the teacher really should explicitly be teaching some of these points and then having students look for more information, create a graphic organizer around the information, or some other follow-up activity. But I'm seeing that this sharing has been taken a little bit to an extreme. Now, some of you may be surprised to hear me say that, because for decades I've been a very firm advocate of oral language development. One of the components of the SIOP model, which we developed, is interaction. And so I've published on instructional conversations and having students work in partners and small groups, grappling with ideas, discussing topics and so forth. And I still believe that, but it needs to be done in the right context, in the right way, and with the right amount of time allocated to that activity. Now, some of you may be math teachers or social studies teachers, ESL teachers who cover the gamut of content areas, and you wonder why I've made so many references to reading and to literacy. And that's because reading is really the foundation for learning. It cuts across all content areas, and I'm a strong advocate of reading across the curriculum. So it's hard to do well in math if you can't understand the instructions, if you can't do the word problems, same with social studies, science, and etc. So all content areas rely on reading. Not only that, the reason I mentioned that about independent reading before is because the research, the international literature on second language learners tells us that our English learners or any second language learner needs to know about 95 to 98% of words to be able to make sense of the text that they're reading. So that makes sense when you think that background is such a large component of comprehension. I mean, comprehension in many ways is based on our background knowledge, right? And our English learners sometimes haven't been exposed to the background knowledge that's essential for comprehending the text, either because of interrupted schooling, because of the cultural variation, and it doesn't make sense to them culturally, or they may just not have understood and learned some of the prerequisite background knowledge because they're in the process of learning English. So some things there were some gaps in their previous learning. So we need to make sure that students have a strong understanding of vocabulary before we leave them to make sense of it on their own. And English learners should be provided with challenging text, but with the essential scaffolding and supports in place so that they can understand the text and begin to make sense of the academic vocabulary. And speaking of vocabulary, students need to have at least 6 encounters with a word before they learn it. However, for students to take those words and make them their own, use them as part of their own linguistic repertoire, they need 20 or perhaps more encounters with those words. So what does that mean for teachers? It means we need to explicitly teach key vocabulary, and then when we come across those words in text, highlight it, point it out, make reference back to it, create vocabulary notebooks, have students turn to that page and make that connection between the word that they've seen before. There are myriad ways to develop vocabulary, and we need to employ those ways, keeping in mind that students don't learn the word and have it become their own when they've seen it 1 to 5 times. They need multiple exposures to those words to make it understandable for them and something that they can then use. So that's how we should use instructional time. Use it well, have the pace appropriate, and the content appropriate. And then one other issue is using scaffolding to access content as well as teaching English language development. Some of you may be aware that my colleagues and I developed SIOP, which is an approach for teaching English learners, or as the title says, making content comprehensible for English learners. It's an approach for lesson planning, lesson delivery, and lesson reflection. It has 8 components, and as you can see, none of the components are particularly unique, but research has shown that we need to have all of these components in our lesson plans throughout to cover over a week or so to make an impact on students. There are so many different techniques and ideas out there online in books and so forth, and so there's lots of different ideas for teaching English learners, but our research and the research of others has shown that these are the critical components that need to be present consistently and systematically in order to improve students' academic achievement as well as their English language proficiency. And that's what the research studies have shown. So we want to use the practices that are reflected in the SIOP model. And one of them is this idea of modeling, and then one of the components, of course, is practice and application. But in these observations I did, I really noticed a lack of modeling and practice. There's just not enough practice going on. Now, I'm a tennis player, and so I often think about the struggles of English learners as I am taking, for example, taking a lesson, because the instructor will be saying that I need to move the racket in this certain way. So fine, I practice that, I practice it. And then he'll say, well, when you finish that stroke, then you need to have your feet in this certain way. So then I think, okay, great. So I'm focused on my feet, and I can't move the racket in the way he wants me to do it because I'm so focused on my feet. And that it reminds me of English learners, because I think they're so bombarded with information, with different skills, but nothing is practiced well enough, deeply enough, so that they can master it and use it. So what is a good way to teach to make sure that doesn't happen? Well, of course, the first one is modeling, which my instructor does, models how to do it first. So let's just say we're going to teach students how to outline material, which of course is an important skill for them to learn how to pull out the salient information from a text. So the first thing I would do if I'm teaching is I would show them an outline, give them a model, give them an example. What is this thing outline this teacher keeps saying? They don't know what it looks like. So I show an outline. Then together we would read a passage, and on the document reader or PowerPoint or on the board, whiteboard, whatever, visually show an example of, we'll read this, what are the main points of this passage that we can add to our outline, and so forth. And so then we would put that there so that they would see it. So it's similar to the I do, you do, we do, you do, but for English learners, there's an additional step of I do, so I model it and show it, we do it together, then you all do, so the students work in partners or teams to practice some more, and then the student is ready for independent you do. But it requires repetition, much like the tennis. It requires so many opportunities to practice. And again, it goes back to that multiple encounters with words. The more that students are using those words and practicing, they're enhancing their language development as well as their academic knowledge of the topic that they're outlining. And then we want to give them an opportunity to apply. Practice and then apply. So they learned it in this context. So now let's take another text and apply it there. Because we want students to not just to learn a skill for learning the skill's sake, we want them to generalize to other settings. So they know how to do it with this passage. Now how about with this passage? How about in this other class? And so forth. So that's why practice is so very, very important for English learners. I think a part of the issue with long-term English learners is that they're exposed to so much information, so many words, so many different skills, but without digging deeper, it amounts to a lot of superficial exposure, and it just doesn't stick. So for I left perhaps the most important point for last, and that is your students. You can use time wisely. You can implement SIOP beautifully. You can, provide a lot of modeling and practice for students and scaffold their instruction. But unless you know your students, unless you care about your students, really the point of teaching is lost. Some of the points I would say about knowing your students, some suggestions would be learn their names, learn how to pronounce their name and call students by name. When you see them in the hallway, when you see them on the playground, say hello and use their name. And then find out a little something about each one. What are their passions? What are their strengths? What are their talents? What subject do they hate? Find out something about them and touch base with them daily. You might consider standing at the door at the beginning of the period. So as students come in, greet each one by name, say a little something. How was your soccer game yesterday? Any little thing that you know about them, just make some kind of a personal comment to them, because we want to communicate to students, especially our English learners, we want to communicate that we care about them, that they mean something to us, that they have a place, they belong in our classroom and in our school. So we want to make that kind of very important connection with them. And the last point is just practice the golden rule. Treat students like you would want to be treated. When I am in classrooms where teachers are respectful to students, they respect their culture, they respect them as individuals, they treat them kindly, they ask politely, students reciprocate and do the same, and in fact want to please the teacher and work hard for the teacher. And in other classrooms where teachers are sarcastic, may inadvertently embarrass students by correcting them in front of others or pointing out weaknesses, those are the classrooms where I see students disengaged and where I see a lot more behavior issues. So treat others as you would want to be treated. And another part of that and making that connection with students is celebrating each success. You know, long-term gains, even annual gains, don't happen overnight. They happen incrementally with little successes every single day. And so we want to celebrate each success to encourage students to continue with their effort, but encourage them with specific academic feedback. Instead of just saying good job or nicely done, give them specific feedback that communicates to them that their effort is important, that their effort is rewarded, and that their effort is appreciated. And so in that way, students are going to be more motivated to continue to advance their English proficiency as well as their academic achievement. So now we're back to our question about how far to push. And I would just answer it by simply saying that when you know your students, when you implement teaching in a way that's reflected in SIOP, where you have interaction among students, you can walk around the groups, you can hear whose language proficiency is struggling and whose is advancing. You can listen in on discussions about academic topics and see how who needs a little bit of a mini lesson in a certain area, who has a misunderstanding about something. You get to know your students through effective instruction, through making those connections and making them feel important. And when you do that, then you have a gauge of how much to challenge them and when to back off. It will become apparent to you, and you will know exactly how to lead them down the path to success. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference.